Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the most tragic and, I think, legally complex modern cases. The long, dark shadow cast over Kathleen Folbigg.
It's a story that really forces us to confront some fundamental questions about justice, about science, and about the nature of human grief.
We're examining how a string of unexplained infant deaths in a single family led to a controversial conviction, one based purely on inference and statistics, only to be dismantled 2 decades later by the uncompromising clarity of modern genomics.
That's right. We're talking about a woman who spent 20 years in prison. Kathleen Folbigg was convicted back in 2003 of the murder of her 4 infant children, Caleb, Patrick, Sarah, and Laura. Our source materials, they really track her decades-long fight, detailing her initial trauma, the flawed evidence used to convict her, and of course the scientific breakthrough that led to her unconditional pardon in 2023.
The core paradox here, and it's the reason this case remains such a profound touchstone for legal reform, is that there was never any direct physical evidence proving the alleged crimes.
None at all.
The prosecution successfully built its entire case on 2 pillars that were, subjective, statistical, or interpretive. You had the highly improbable odds of 4 natural deaths, and then this deeply negative reading of her private, agonizing diary entries.
Precisely. And our mission today is to move beyond the emotion of the case, as difficult as that is, and to rigorously analyze the evidence structure. We really need to understand how the prevailing medical assumptions of the time, the application of a now discredited legal maxim, and the limitations of forensic pathology all intersected to produce what can only be called a catastrophic failure of the justice system.
It really shows us that when the legal system is confronted with a genuine enigma, like the sudden, unexplained death of an infant, the pressure to provide an answer can sometimes override the pursuit of objective truth.
Yeah, the need for a neat narrative.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this journey. I think we need to start with the devastating foundation, the background of Kathleen Folbigg and the sequence of these losses.
To really understand the vulnerability that would later be exploited in court, we have to begin with Kathleen Megan Britton, who was born in 1967. Her early life was defined by extreme tragedy, even before she was 2 years old.
It's almost unbelievable. Her mother, Kathleen Mary Donovan, was brutally murdered, stabbed 24 times by Kathleen's own biological father, Thomas John Britton.
An immense, devastating context to carry through life. Her father served 15 years in prison before he was deported. And this, of course, immediately rendered the young Kathleen a ward of the state.
So she was placed into foster care, moved around. I believe our sources mentioned she spent time in an institutional setting, the Badura Children's Home, before finally settling into a stable foster placement until adulthood.
And this history of early violence, of loss, of institutional instability, it would become absolutely crucial context for understanding the deep emotional fragility that was expressed in the journals that the prosecution later weaponized against her.
It absolutely sets the stage for a life marked by instability and loss.
It does. And after she married Craig Gibson Folbigg in 1987, she began her family. And the sequence of infant deaths spanned exactly a decade, from 1989 to 1999.
Let's detail these events systematically, because the specific medical conditions and the circumstances of each death they're just essential context for the eventual genetic findings. We have to understand them one by one.
Okay, so the first child was Caleb Gibson Folbigg. He was born on February 1st, 1989. Now, Caleb was diagnosed with mild laryngomalacia.
Right, which is a condition where the voice box cartilage is softer than normal. It's often called a floppy larynx, I believe.
That's the common term for it, yes. It often causes noisy breathing. And while it's usually something a child outgrows, it can increase vulnerability to breathing issues, especially when they're very young.
And Caleb died at just 19 days old on February 20, 1989.
He did. Kathleen Folbigg found him after he'd been briefly restless between midnight and 2 a.m. The cause of death at the time was attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDs.
SIDs, which was, back then, really the catch-all diagnosis when no other cause could be found, wasn't it? It was a diagnosis of exclusion.
It was. An enigma, a heartbreaking mystery that left parents with a terrible burden of unanswered questions.
Okay, so then came the second child.
Next was Patrick Allen Folbigg, born on June 3rd, 1990. And Patrick's story is slightly different, and it's a crucial difference. In October of 1990, when he was just 4 months old, he suffered what was called an apparent life-threatening event.
And his father, Craig, was there and performed CPR?
He did, and he was successful. Patrick survived, but he was left with profound neurological damage. He was later diagnosed with epilepsy and also with cortical blindness.
Cortical blindness, meaning his eyes could see, but his brain couldn't process the visual information.
Exactly. So this makes Patrick's situation fundamentally distinct from Caleb's SID's diagnosis. He had confirmed severe pre-existing conditions. He was a very sick baby.
And 4 months later, on February 13th, 1991, he died.
He did. His death was officially attributed to seizures, which were related to his neurological damage. And our source material highlights a really crucial detail here. When Folbigg called her husband at work, she said, "It's happened again."
A statement that would later be interpreted by the prosecution as an admission of a repeated action, a sort of confession.
Yes. But by the defense, it was seen as an expression of crushing, fatalistic despair. This nightmare is happening to us again. Two completely different readings of the same 4 words.
The third child was Sarah Kathleen Folbigg. She was born October 14th, 1992.
And Sarah died at 10 months old on August 29th, 1993. Like Caleb, her death was initially labeled SIDs.
And finally, Laura.
Laura Elizabeth Folbigg, born August 7, 1997. She lived the longest of the 4, dying at 18 months old on February 27, 1999.
Now, with Laura, it's really important to remember that her autopsy actually found something specific, didn't it?
It did. It found signs of myocarditis,
Which is an inflammation of the heart muscle.
Yes, a known natural cause of sudden cardiac death. So even at the very beginning with Laura, there was a plausible natural explanation present in the postmortem report.
So the key unifying factor for all 4 children, and this becomes the linchpin of the defense later on, is that in every single case, the autopsies found 0 physical evidence.
0.
No bruising, no petechiae. Those are the pinpoint hemorrhages you often see in smothering cases. No injuries at all to suggest smothering or any form of physical homicide.
None. The entire legal case had to be built on inference. It was about making the jump from a series of circumstantial events to a criminal intent.
Which brings us to that flawed legal foundation. Part 2, the conviction, and how they managed to secure a guilty verdict without a shred of physical evidence of a crime.
The investigation really started to take shape in 1999. This was when Kathleen was first incriminated by her estranged husband, Craig. The police investigation followed, and that led to her arrest in April of 2001.
And the trial itself in 2003, it was long. It spanned 7 weeks and was, by all accounts, just emotionally grueling.
Absolutely. The prosecution's theory was brutal and simple, that Kathleen Folbigg, driven by frustration, intentionally smothered her children. But as we've said, without physical evidence, they needed a mechanism. They needed something to convince the jury that the sheer number of deaths was, in itself, a proxy for guilt.
And that mechanism was a heavy, heavy reliance on statistical evidence.
Yes, specifically what our source material accurately labels the now dubious Meadows Law. This maxim, which was coined by the since-disgraced British pediatrician Roy Meadows, states, famously, 1 sudden infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder until proven otherwise.
That maxim is so profoundly dangerous in a courtroom setting. I think we need to pause here and really explain why this statistical argument is so flawed, especially when you're applying it to deaths within a single family.
It's flawed because its statistical foundation relies on a critical and scientifically false premise, and that premise is the assumption of independence.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
Meadows' law calculates the probability of 4 SIDS deaths occurring independently. So that's like asking, what are the odds of 4 random, unrelated families across the country each having a SIDS death in the same year? If the average rate of SI deaths is, let's say for argument's sake, 1 in 1,000, then the chance of 4 unrelated SIDS deaths is astronomically low. You multiply it out, 1 in a trillion maybe?
So the prosecution stands up in court and says, look at these odds. It couldn't possibly be natural. This is not bad luck. This is murder.
Exactly. But the flaw is this. When you're calculating the risk within one family unit, you absolutely cannot assume independence. The children are not unrelated data points. They share genetics. They share an environment.
Right. So if one child dies from an undiagnosed genetic predisposition,
But the siblings share that genetic vulnerability. They therefore face a drastically increased risk. They're genetically linked, which means the probabilities are no longer multiplied. They're correlated. Meadows' maxim failed entirely to account for rare, shared familial, genetic, or environmental factors.
by failing to acknowledge that shared risk, the law essentially shifted the burden of proof, didn't it? It demanded that the defense prove a series of extraordinary natural tragedies instead of the prosecution having to prove deliberate homicide.
It did, completely. And this statistical argument It provided the necessary feeling of certainty where the physical evidence had failed, and then they brought in the second pillar to support this theory.
The diaries?
The diaries, her personal journals, which her husband had turned over to the police.
And these private journals became a psychological battleground.
They really did. The prosecution interpreted specific phrases as admissions of guilt. They suggested she was conscious of having acted against her children out of frustration or temper. For example, entries where she discussed her temper, her stress, her feelings of being out of control, or her reflections on the death, these were all presented as circumstantial evidence of intent.
But the defense offered a completely different lens. They argued that these were the desperate, dark, and self-lacerating writings of a profoundly grieving mother. A mother who is internalizing the cultural narrative that she must somehow be responsible for these unexplained deaths.
A woman with her own deeply traumatic childhood, grappling with unimaginable loss.
Right. They argue these entries were not admissions of murder, but expressions of a typical, if extreme, form of the crushing parental guilt that often follows Eside's death, compounded by her own history.
And that distinction is just key. A grieving parent often blames themselves. They think, I wasn't attentive enough, or I felt a moment of frustration, and then this happened. It's a very common, very human reaction.
So the defense presented other parts of the diaries, entries showing immense love and concern, detailing her efforts to care for the children.
But those were often overshadowed by the handful of entries that were deemed incriminating. The emotional weight of the statistics from Meadows' Law, combined with this hostile interpretation of her most private, anguished thoughts, it just proved overwhelming for the jury.
What about the specific medical conditions? What were the counter-arguments the defense introduced there during the trial?
Well, the defense was pretty robust in challenging the assumed lack of natural causes. They noted that even the prosecution's own witnesses expressed concern about the lack of prodromal or early warning symptoms that you'd typically see in smothering cases.
Like a struggle.
Exactly, signs of a struggle. Furthermore, they kept highlighting the known medical complexities we've already discussed. Caleb's floppy larynx, Patrick's confirmed epilepsy and cortical blindness, and critically, the myocarditis that was actually found during Laura's autopsy.
So they were arguing that while SID itself remained an enigma, these known vulnerabilities pointed toward natural death far more strongly than an evidence-free homicide theory.
That was the core of their medical argument, but it wasn't enough.
No. Despite that debate, the jury returned the guilty verdict in May of 2003. She was convicted of 3 counts of murder, 1 of manslaughter for Caleb's death, and 1 count of maliciously inflicting grievous bodily harm for Patrick's life-threatening event.
The initial sentencing was incredibly harsh, 40 years, with a 30-year non-parole period. That was later reduced on appeal in 2005 to 30 years, with 25 non-parole.
And the personal cost was just immense. Our sources note the tragic reality of her incarceration. Because of the nature of the crimes she was convicted of, she was designated for protective custody.
And yet, even within the prison walls, her ordeal continued. This culminated in her being savagely beaten by another inmate in January 2021 after a prison transfer. It just underscores the compounding trauma of a wrongful conviction. It's not only the loss of your freedom, but the constant exposure to violence and isolation.
And so we move into part 3, the slow, arduous process of challenging this legal certainty, a process that started not in a courtroom, but in academia.
The first real crack in that consensus arrived in 2011. It came with the legal academic Emma Cunliffe's book, Murder, Medicine, and Motherhood.
And Cunliffe, she performed a really detailed analysis of the trial evidence, didn't she?
She did. She argued compellingly for wrongful conviction based on 2 main pillars. First, the presentation of misleading medical evidence that overrode the concept of reasonable doubt, and second, the highly prejudicial and frankly biased interpretation of those private diary entries.
This book was important because it generated crucial media attention. It injected a sustained skepticism back into the public narrative and provided the first major academic pushback against the jury's decision.
And this academic pressure soon prompted a professional forensic reevaluation. In 2013, Folbigg's legal team secured the involvement of Dr. Stephen Cordner, a world-renowned forensic pathologist at Monash University.
Cordner's review was meticulous. I believe it resulted in a detailed 121-page report that directly challenged the forensic assumptions of the original trial.
It did, and he was very specific. What specific forensic points did Cordner focus on to really dismantle the prosecution's case?
He systematically addressed the original autopsies, looking at them with fresh eyes. He was particularly focused on the death of Sarah. He concluded that Sarah's death was, and this is a quote, an almost textbook example of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS.
So not suspicious, but textbook SIs.
Exactly. His most powerful argument, however, was holistic. He looked at the known medical history of all 4 children: Caleb's laryngomalacia, Patrick's seizures and cortical damage, and Laura's myocarditis. And he concluded that these existing natural conditions more strongly supported natural causes than the entirely evidence-free hypothesis of smothering.
This shifts the argument significantly, doesn't it? It's not just saying you can't prove homicide, it's saying we have positive medical reasons to believe these deaths were, in fact, natural.
Precisely. And Cordner's critique wasn't just about the facts, it was about the process. He delivered a searing rebuke regarding the expert testimony from the 2003 trial. He stated very clearly, "It is wrong to rely on the forensic pathology evidence provided in this case to support the conclusion that one or more of the Folbigg children are the victims of a homicide."
Wow. That is a direct challenge to the authority of the original trial's pathology.
It is, and he emphasized the danger of forcing a narrative where medical uncertainty reigned. He noted, "There is no merit in forcing certainty where uncertainty exists. The very existence of the enigma of SIDS demonstrates how little we know about why some babies die."
Cordner's point was so critical. The moment you assume homicide based purely on statistics on Meadows' law, you stop looking for the actual rare natural cause. You sacrifice reasonable doubt for a false sense of certainty.
Cordner's report, which was submitted in 2015, finally spurred some legal action. In August of 2018, the NSW Attorney General at the time, Mark Speakman, announced the first judicial inquiry into the convictions.
And this was specifically mandated to review the evolving medical evidence and, as he put it, to ensure public confidence.
Yes, and Speakman noted they were specifically looking at evidence concerning the incidence of reported deaths of 3 or more infants in the same family that were attributed to unidentified natural causes. So this suggests the legal system was finally starting to grapple with the scientific critique of Meadows' law.
Yet, even with all this mounting pressure, the judicial system proved to be incredibly resistant to change.
It did. The official conclusion of that first inquiry, which was released in July 2019 by Reginald Blanche, a former chief judge, it dismissed the growing evidence.
Incredibly, Blanche found that he did not have any reasonable doubt as to the guilt of Kathleen Folbigg for the offenses of which she was convicted.
That must have been just a devastating blow after years and years of effort.
A massive setback. Folbigg's legal team immediately sought a review of the inquiry itself, citing potential bias, but that appeal was ultimately rejected in March of 2021. The legal system seemed just utterly entrenched in that original 2003 verdict.
It was clear it would take something else, an entirely new field of science genomics, to finally overcome this resistance.
And here is where the narrative shifts completely. We move into part 4, the scientific breakthrough that provided objective biological facts to counteract 2 decades of circumstantial interpretation.
The genomic investigation. This was driven by immunologist Dr. Carola Garcia de Vinuesa and geneticist Todor Arsov. They looked beyond the police files and the court transcripts, and they focused instead on the actual genetic code.
They examined DNA samples that were retrieved from Kathleen Folbigg and, crucially, from her deceased children's hospital cards. And their initial crucial discovery centered on Kathleen herself. She carried a unique, rare, and potentially lethal mutation in a gene called KLM2.
Okay, let's elaborate on this because this is so important.
Right.
What exactly is the KLM2 gene, and why is this mutation such a game changer in this case?
So the CALM genes, there are 3 of them, CLM1, 2, and 3, they encode a protein called calmodulin, and calmodulin is absolutely critical. It acts as a kind of molecular sensor, regulating the flow of calcium ions within the body's cells, particularly in the heart and in the nervous system.
And in the heart, this calcium signaling, what does it do?
It governs the speed and the force of the heart's muscle contractions and, most crucially, the relaxation phase, which is known as repolarization. It controls the entire rhythm.
So if there is a mutation in KLM2, the calcium signaling is faulty, the rhythm is off.
Precisely. Variations in these CALM genes are strongly linked to severe cardiac channelopathies. The most famous one you might have heard of is long QT syndrome.
Right.
Long QT syndrome causes a delayed repolarization of the heart after a beat. This makes the heart susceptible to sudden, chaotic, and often fatal arrhythmias, especially under stress or, importantly, during sleep. Folbigg's specific KLM2 mutation was a rare variant, but other calmodulin variants were already known globally to be associated with sudden, unexplained cardiac death in infancy.
So the scientific team then had to trace this vulnerability. Which of the children had inherited this specific KLM2 mutation.
The genetic analysis, which was published in a major scientific journal in November 2020, confirmed it. The two daughters, Sarah and Laura, had both inherited this specific KLM2 mutation from their mother.
And the scientific consensus was powerful. The mutation altered their heart rhythm, predisposing them to sudden, unexpected cardiac death.
And this genetic explanation, it just beautifully integrates the non-homicidal factors that were present in the girls' lives. It connects all the dots seamlessly.
How so?
Well, the scientists proposed that this underlying cardiac predisposition could have been acutely triggered or accelerated by what they called intercurrent infections. For Sarah, there was evidence of a respiratory tract infection at the time of her death.
Okay, so a common illness that for a normal child is minor, but for her, it was a trigger.
It could have been a fatal trigger. And for Laura, there was the existing myocarditis, the inflammation of the heart muscle found in her autopsy. That would have put extraordinary stress on an already genetically vulnerable heart.
And they also noted, I believe, that Laura had been given pseudoephedrine.
Yes, a common decongestant. But it's known to speed up the heart rate and can, in rare cases, trigger arrhythmias in individuals who are susceptible. So you have a perfect storm of factors for Laura: a genetic flaw, an infection, and medication.
This provided a natural, objective, and specific mechanism for the deaths of the two girls. It completely removed the need for a theory based on human action.
And we really have to stress the rarity again, as the sources do. KLM2 mutations are exceedingly rare. They're estimated to occur in only about 1 out of every 35 million individuals.
So the mathematical improbability was completely reversed.
Completely. It wasn't improbable that the two girls died from this. In fact, it was the explanation for why two children in the same family died in this way. They shared a known, rare, and lethal genetic vulnerability.
Okay, so that covers the girls, Sarah and Laura. But the boys, Caleb and Patrick, they presented a more neurological profile, particularly Patrick with his severe epilepsy and blindness. Did the genetic team find a parallel explanation for them?
They did. The genomic investigation also addressed the deaths of Caleb and Patrick, and they found that each of the boys carried 2 potentially lethal genetic mutations in a different gene. This one was called the BSN gene.
BSN. What does that stand for, and what's its function?
It stands for bassoon presynaptic cytomatrix protein. It's a bit of a mouthful.
It is.
But essentially, the BSN protein is crucial for establishing and maintaining the synapses, the communication junctions between neurons in the brain. It helps regulate how signals are sent and received.
So mutations here would cause neurological dysfunction.
Severe neurological dysfunction. In fact, these mutations are known in animal models to cause things like early onset lethal epilepsy in mice. The specific combination of mutations that were found in Caleb and Patrick meant they were highly vulnerable to neurological crises.
And what was the inheritance pattern here? Was it also from their mother?
This was different and also crucial. One of the BSN mutations was inherited from their mother, Kathleen, but the second crucial mutation was inherited from their father, Craig.
So they got one from each parent.
Exactly. This provided a natural, biological explanation for the boy's neurological vulnerability, and it mapped perfectly onto Patrick's confirmed history of severe epileptic seizures and related neurological trauma prior to his death.
So after 2 decades of circumstantial inference and statistical doubt, the scientific evidence provided an objective, natural cause of death for all 4 children.
Yes. KLM2 defects causing sudden cardiac death in the daughters, and BSN mutations causing a lethal neurological vulnerability in the sons.
The weight of this combined genomic evidence, it must have been overwhelming.
It completely negated the statistical argument, Meadows' law, that had formed the absolute bedrock of her conviction. It was no longer a question of probability, it was a question of biological fact.
The scientific community recognized the gravity of this immediately, didn't they? In March of 2021, they took a really remarkable collective action.
They did. A petition was signed by more than 100 eminent Australian scientists and medical professionals, including, of course, the genetic researchers themselves. This petition was published by the Australian Academy of Science. It formally provided compelling scientific and medical explanations for all 4 deaths and demanded that the NSW governor grant Kathleen Folbigg a pardon.
This was a direct, organized confrontation between the scientific establishment and the legal establishment.
It was. This public intervention from such a vast and respected group of experts essentially declared that the original statistical conviction was medically impossible in light of the new data. It confirmed that the entire argument of improbability was destroyed by the medical reality of extremely rare, naturally occurring genetic mutations that were shared within the family.
This brings us to part 5, The final exoneration and the broader reflection on justice. That scientific pressure finally broke the judicial stalemate.
It did. The overwhelming scientific consensus just made the maintenance of the conviction untenable. A second judicial inquiry was announced in May of 2022, and it was specifically tasked with reviewing this new genomic evidence.
And this inquiry moved much more quickly than the first.
Much more quickly. On June 5, 2023, the NSW Attorney General Michael Daley advised Governor Margaret Beasley to exercise the royal prerogative of mercy.
That is the moment of definitive legal recognition.
It is. Kathleen Folbigg was granted an unconditional pardon, and she was released from prison that very same day, having served 20 years of her sentence.
But an unconditional pardon, while it releases her, it doesn't technically overturn the conviction itself, does it?
That's a very important legal distinction. No, it doesn't. The final formal legal vindication came several months later on December 14, 2023. That's when the Court of Criminal Appeal officially quashed her previous convictions entirely. They found that the new scientific evidence definitively established reasonable doubt of her guilt.
The evolution of the concept of reasonable doubt in this case is just startling. In 2003, doubt was suppressed by statistical probability and an emotional interpretation of her diaries. In 2023, doubt was restored and certainty was destroyed by objective molecular evidence.
And this case, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident. It provides crucial context when we look at the history of high-profile wrongful convictions that were driven by flawed medical or statistical evidence. Our sources draw clear parallels with other cases rooted in circumstantial evidence surrounding infant deaths.
Let's detail some of those parallels, because understanding the pattern is so important. We often hear the name Sally Clark mentioned in this context.
Sally Clark, yes, a British solicitor. She was convicted in 1999 of murdering her 2 infant sons. Like Folbigg, her conviction relied incredibly heavily on the discredited statistical analysis presented by Roy Meadow.
The same man, same theory.
The very same. He claimed the odds of 2 SI died deaths in an affluent family were infinitesimally small. Her conviction was overturned on appeal in 2003 after it was revealed that the prosecution's own medical expert had failed to disclose crucial evidence showing one of her sons had a bacterial infection that could have explained his death.
And she spent 3 years in prison.
She did, and the experience tragically led to her early death from alcohol poisoning years later. The common thread is the misuse of statistics to assume homicide where there is none.
And then perhaps the most famous Australian miscarriage of justice, Lindy Chamberlain Creighton.
Lindy Chamberlain Creighton was wrongfully convicted in 1982 for the murder of her 9-week-old daughter, Azaria, whose death was actually caused by a dingo attack near Uluru.
The initial conviction there was based on questionable forensic evidence and, just as importantly, a highly prejudicial public perception and intense media scrutiny.
Exactly. The public and the court, they struggled to accept the highly improbable but natural explanation, a dingo taking a child, and instead they relied on a subjective interpretation of her character and her behavior. Her lack of public emotion was seen as guilt.
And like Folbigg, it took years and multiple inquiries for the truth to prevail, leading to her exoneration and a formal death certificate finally confirming the dingo attack.
Another parallel mentioned in the sources is Patty Stallings from the United States.
What happened in her case?
Patty Stallings was convicted in 1989 for the murder of her son, Ryan, who died suddenly. The prosecution argued she had poisoned him with antifreeze. However, Ryan suffered from a rare genetic metabolic disorder called methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA.
And the symptoms of this disorder mimic poisoning.
They do. Stallings was exonerated in 1991 when DNA testing proved she was not the biological mother of a later child whose condition led doctors to correctly diagnose MMA in the family. It just highlights again how these rare, complex medical conditions can be misinterpreted as homicide when the science available at the time is insufficient.
It's clear that the pattern often involves the judiciary, finding it easier to accept human malice than to accept biological or natural extreme rarity.
That tendency is deeply human, but it is catastrophic for justice. However, it is vital to keep the complexity in sight here. Our source material makes a crucial point of balance by mentioning the case of Maxine Robinson.
Who was she?
Robinson was a UK mother who was a serial child killer. She confessed to the crimes. And the judge in her case noted that it served as a necessary reminder that, quote, not all mothers in prison for killing their children are victims of miscarriages of justice.
That provides a very necessary grounding. We're not arguing that the system is always wrong.
Not all.
We're analyzing the profound structural failure that occurred specifically in the Folbigg case due to the reliance on outdated scientific concepts in the realm. and a prejudicial interpretation of her grief. The focus here is rigorously examining how a statistical and psychological construction was definitively overturned by biological fact.
And if we synthesize this entire journey, the fundamental transformation was moving from a legal case built on Meadows' discredited maxim and the interpretation of private grief to a modern, evidence-based refutation built on genomics that provided irrefutable natural causes for all four deaths. The uncertainty that Dr. Cordner spoke of back in 2013 was finally resolved by a field of science genomics that had matured significantly since Kathleen Folbigg was first charged.
So the deepest insight this case really offers us is how rapidly evolving scientific knowledge, specifically these deep dives into fields like genomics and cardiology, must compel the justice system to re-examine historical judgments. The very concept of reasonable doubt has been redefined by our ability to sequence and understand the human genome.
Indeed, the Folbigg case serves as a powerful and very somber lesson that the justice system's certainty is only as reliable as the contemporary science it relies upon. Future cases involving multiple unexplained infant deaths will now face mandatory, rigorous genetic screening, recognizing that rare familial genetic vulnerabilities have to be excluded before the highly improbable conclusion of homicide can even be considered.
It demonstrates that the greatest risk to justice lies in that human impulse to force an answer where genuine medical uncertainty exists.
Exactly.
We'll leave you with this thought for your consideration. Given the profound impact of Folbigg's initial traumatic childhood on her life, which arguably contributed to the emotional intensity we see in her diary, how should the legal system adapt its methods for interpreting subjective emotional documents like personal journals when objective scientific evidence, such as comprehensive genomic data, is now available? This is a fundamental tension between psychology and biology that for you, the listener, is something you can continue to explore.